Welcome to part 3 in this series of reviews on Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition by RPGresearch.com founder Hawke Robinson. This segment covers the character creation overview, not detail, but overview of creating a character in the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, contrasts and compares in some aspects. So this is an overview of character creation in a few simple steps, basically 5 main steps. Step 1 involves, it's a little bit different, so before you might roll first and then choose your race and class, depending upon your approach. In this case they emphasize choose your race first, then your class, then your stats. Step 4 is where the key difference in 5th edition from previous versions, which is backgrounds and much more emphasis on your character's story and motivations. And then 5th edition equipment list, which has a generous number of lists compared to previous versions, and I especially love their trinkets list, which we'll cover later. One thing that says a lot about some of the differences in 5th edition from, let's say, 4th edition or 3rd edition is a de-emphasis of skills and feats. You'll see player character sheet that the skills section that's it. That's skills. You have your saving throws, your attributes, your skills. So they're really downplaying it. Though feats are still around, they're much more story, character, background, motivation driven. They're much more part of who your character is rather than yet another statistical way to manipulate your system and min-max and such. So the core character sheet, if you're a non-spellcaster, is just 2 pages. Then they have a 3rd sheet for spellcasting, and that's pretty much it for the core character sheet. Now they do offer a free PDF from the wizards.com website. You can download the exact same version that's in the book, or they have an alternate version as well in a different styling in the PDF, the download option. And of course they have the PDF download for the basic rules. Another thing to note is even the de-emphasis of equipment. That's your equipment section. Now, there's plenty of room to do, you've got backstory, treasure, features and traits, allies and organizations. And if you print these only one-sided, of course, you have room for equipment. But for equipment, it is significantly de-emphasized. I mean, that is something that, is a little concerning, but it's interesting. It seems to indicate a very different motivation to this game than previous versions that might have large equipment and skills sections. So something to note there. And again, it's kind of foreshadows the difference in this edition as far as where the emphasis is. So you go ahead and pick your race, and I'll cover the races in a separate section. Each of these I will cover in a separate section, so you can jump to race or class or stats or background or equipment in detail. Right now this section is just covering the overview. You choose your class. They have a quick build option if you wish, which is basically, they've had that around. It's not new. It's templating archetype, so that's still a variant here called quick build, which gives you a set combination you can pick from your race and class and such, or from your class. And of course you have your stats to pick from. It's the same 6 stats that have been around all these years of Dungeons & Dragons since 1974. I still personally add for mine a section for comeliness that was first introduced in the Unearthed Arcana 1st edition, well, Dragon magazine originally, but the Unearthed Arcana 1st edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they introduced comeliness there, and I've kept that in every version of D&D since. I've always liked the idea of keeping the appearance separate from their charisma capabilities, kind of, so, and also when we do that, so everybody gets to roll their 6 attributes, assign them where they want, but their 7th one for comeliness, whatever they roll, that's it. They don't get to choose or pick what it is. That way people, don't fudge the comeliness stat as much. So that's a house rule. Nothing about it in here at all, of course, but something they threw out there for people. And they do offer the point approach instead of rolling. Not new. And here the allocation of modifiers for each stat level pretty much continues the same from 3rd edition onward. And character advancement, that's something that we'll get into more later, but it's been flattened for all classes in that there's a proficiency bonus for all classes. and we'll talk about more of that in later segments. So that's the quick overview of the character creation segment. The next segment of this series will be regarding races. Which races do they have? Did they keep? Did they add? Did they remove? We'll cover that in a little bit more detail. And remember, the first run of this series is going to be more high level. I'm not going to get too heavy into each individual mechanic. It'll be an overview. Then, as people ask questions, I can come back with more detailed segments. So the races section is going to be an overview of races, but I won't get into covering every little pro and con of each race. It'll just be an overview for you to look through and see what's available in the 5th edition. Step 4, describe your character, is really, I think, the most distinctive difference in 5th edition from 3rd and 4th edition, and arguably even previous editions. They really spend, not only as you saw on the character sheet, more space on the character sheet for the background, and they bring in bonds, ideals, flaws, etc., which we'll get into more in that section when we get to it. But really the whole point of it is really getting a clear background story to your character and your motivations. And they're non-numerical for the most part. They are completely story-driven. And that, I think, would be the most significant difference. The others, you know, race, class, stats, that pretty much continues to be standard fare for D&D. And this is certainly nothing new for other role-playing games. There are plenty of other role-playing games that emphasize this approach. But this is the first time that I think it's really been emphasized in Dungeons & Dragons. And as a game master that really prefers ROLE playing over ROLL playing, that's had me more excited than I was originally about this version coming out. 4th edition was so far away from that. And even 3rd edition I didn't care that much for, especially compared to other game systems, non-Dungeons & Dragons systems. So seeing this increased emphasis on ROLE playing, for me, was encouraging. Again, it depends on your style, but if you prefer that style, then you might like this. So again, lots more on the background, and also the equipment list is much broader and a lot to offer for the first player's handbook. They always had add-on books, but this, for being the first core book, they included a lot more than previous times, which is nice. Also, as they have done in previous versions, and it's generally a good idea for any role-playing game system, they have an example character that they're building as you go through each step. So in this case, it's building Brunor, and this will be a dwarf character, and it goes through, as each step is explained, they then give an example for each step. And so, of course, that's a good thing to do. Some role-playing games forget to do that, and it's very helpful for beginning players. One other comment I have is, whereas I'm glad about the increased emphasis on the character background and story, I am disappointed to see the continuing momentum on point inflation. There is additional point inflation. So, for example, if you took an original or first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons character and tried to convert it to 5th edition, you would see a significant difference in their stats and hit points and abilities to fit into the 5th edition. So it's not unusual in 5th edition to have, with your racial and background and class, to have at first level a stat in the, at a 20, a 1920 starting out. Now, they set some upper limits until 20th level, or depending upon the class and race and such. It's definitely continuing that trend of point inflation. They've given more hit points to the magic user. It's a D6 now instead of a D4. You could argue, you know, one of the biggest problems with the magic users in previous versions is they tend to, once they're out of spells, they kind of have to hide in the party and can't do a whole lot, and they're often, you know, knocked out easily. So maybe a few more hit points they think will help, but of course with the point inflation, the monsters are going to have more too, so it is what it is, but it's definitely continuing point inflation throughout. The other part that is irksome, and we'll talk about more of this later, is the abuse of cantrips. So cantrips were first introduced, Dragon Magazine, etc., but officially in first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, for example, Unearthed Arcana. And they were meant to be the little things that as an apprentice you learn. So to fix some clothing, or to scrub something, or a favorite of everybody's was fire finger. Your finger would shoot a little flame, kind of like a cigarette lighter, Bic lighter. Even though that wasn't dangerous per se, people came up with very creative uses of those cantrips. They were very, very non-powerful spells, and in and of themselves really couldn't do any harm, but you could use them in creative ways beyond their original purpose. And that was a lot of fun for people to have that added. Fast forward to 5th edition cantrips, and now you're casting spells that used to be first level as cantrips. And cantrips you can cast potentially all day long, depending upon your class. Some classes have restrictions, others do not. But it's, on the one hand, it makes a magic user able to stay in the fight longer with fighters and other characters, so they can keep engaging and keep helping to whittle away at an enemy at low level rather than having to hold back and just twiddle their thumbs. But I think it really abuses the original purpose of cantrips and is a significant, probably one of the more significant power inflations of the latest versions of D&D, and something that myself and a few other players rail against every time we have a magic user or spellcaster. And even playing one myself, I just roll my eyes at how much power has been given to the cantrips, which we'll again cover in more detail as we get into each of the classes and into magic specifically in later sessions. And I'm tempted to do a house rule that limits that in some way, or potentially go back to the cantrips of 1st edition, but then we're starting to really overhaul 5th edition core rules, and we'll see. But be warned. But I thought I'd let you know that overall. So on one hand, love the increase in story, while on the other hand, point inflation and the abuse of cantrips is something I don't particularly care for. RPGresearch.com.